Hey Eric, welcome everyone to another episode of what may or may not be, let's say, the Slashcast. So work slash life slash balance. This is more on the balance end of things. We're going to be covering gender, sex, and sexuality today,
Mostly
and
slashing things.
always slashing things. Um, and I'm Dave, and this is Eric. And
Right.
how are things? Maybe this is a topic that you brought up, so maybe you can explain how it came to mind to cover.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna flash up a deck. Hold on a second. Very official today. Hold on a second.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'll just say so. Uh, it is slightly awkward to have two straight men covering these issues, but for one, I do think uh, we can fairly consider ourselves allies. And for another, I think it's important for voices all along the spectrum to reflect openly on these topics so that we can really have the the best dialogue possible and make the most progress possible. Because if any marginalized group is kind of a lone voice in the wilderness, it's much harder to make progress.
Yeah, ultimately this whole thing happened because of all of the, gender related conversations that have been happening on in the media. And I was having a conversation with my mom. She was visiting Singapore, and we were having a conversation with some of the in-laws about the gender issues. And I realized in that conversation that she really didn't understand the fundamentals. So it was very difficult for her to really engage in critique one way or the other because there were certain basic facts about the discussion that she was thinking of as wrong. And as I was kind of digging into it, I realized that for sure a lot of people have some basic mistakes about the terminology, if you will, and there, for example, they're treating gender equivalent to biological sex. So, Trump's declaration that there shall be only two genders. What he means is that there shall be only two biological sexes, I think.
I,
But
I wouldn't be so sure that that's what he means.
yeah, yeah. It just doesn't make any sense when you start to look at it. That's the only problem. But let me walk through. So I kind of created this framework to help explain this whole situation. And as you said, you know, we should be considered allies and we should be considered teachable. So I am very happy to consider that there's more to it than just this. But I thought of the conversation being in these pillars. So the first pillar I think about as biological sex, and this is really just how your body is built. And this can be made up of it's not just guys have penises and women have vaginas, right? There's a lot more to it. There's how what chromosomes you have. It's about the hormones that were impacting the expression of those genes throughout your childhood and adolescence phase. And it's also just environmental factors that impact early development, right? But ultimately, it's about a physicality. And if we think about that in the extremes, then yes, you would have male and you would have female, and those would be sort of the two binary opposites. But actually, if you think about the complexity of all of the variables that go into that, you actually can have uh, a spectrum of between male and female, which I think is generally called intersex. And this is, you may have male genitalia, but your hormones are, or your chromosomes are not XY, right? They might be XYY or a different combination, XXY, I meant, or different combinations, or you could have different hormones or different environmental factors that you know sort of put you not at the end of the spectrum. So if we think of even biological sex, it isn't just one or zero. It's not a either or. Actually, it's a spectrum which is impacted by many variables that ultimately impact the physicality.
So
And that's
just,
in the,
sorry, just for a little bit of context here, but intersex is a category, and some of these other chromosomal places on the spectrum, they're relatively uncommon
yeah.
statistically, right?
I would say that chromosomal differences are relatively uncommon. I wouldn't necessarily say that differences in the bell curve of hormone and hormone expression are very uncommon. I would tend to say that, I mean, I don't know is the answer, but I would imagine that whereas chromosome isn't a bell curve in a human population, the expression of hormones is. And so how genes direct the body to produce hormones is going to be to fall into a bell curve.
Okay, so just to level set slightly, so um, I see three different kind of categories that you're talking about here. So one is the straight chromosomal differences, which are
Yep.
very, very clear to identify. And other than XX and XY, those differences are relatively rare, right?
Yep.
Then there is the actual intersex physiologically, which was called hermaphrodism,
Yep.
right?
So also rare,
Also rare, but also very physically kind of obvious,
obvious.
right?
Yep.
And then a grayer area of hormonal presentation um, in through environment and epigenomics that can lead to uh, just
Invisible.
different, yeah, different expressions along the spectrum. But is this, I guess, how common in this, how definable is this, how useful is this? I know one of the recent controversies was with a female boxer, and another was with a female track athlete, both of whom were chromosomally women, were born identified as women. I don't know of any intersex attributes that they had, but they did have high levels of testosterone and were potentially tagged in being in this kind of,
Intersex
category
category.
in between. So again, so how clear is this? How prevalent is this, and how useful is this?
Well, I think, when we come to the societal implications of this, especially for sports, because that's a topic of interest of late, let's hold that discussion off until we get the full model.
Yeah.
But how common is it? I don't know. I don't know. My suspicion is that hormonal variations are very common, and but chromosomal and physical expression is not. But I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe 98% are bog standard male female. It could
Yeah.
be. I don't know.
Yeah, that seems right. And we can, put something in the show notes if we ever get around to show notes to link to some stats. But I guess again, how useful is this? Because I think it can muddle the
Well,
discussion
I I
slightly.
think I think that I wanted to push the discussion of sports off later, but I think that if you're trying to understand um who should participate in what sports. I think there is a physical difference between male and female, and I think putting them in the same sports event isn't fair to the to everybody. And I think that that's on a biological sex perspective. Gender is because gender
Okay,
is societally
okay, I
driven.
agree. I agree that's taking us a little bit off track. But I mean, I guess it's for the first two categories, it's relatively clear cut, but for the third, it there can be a
Yeah,
lot.
how much makes a difference, right?
Yeah,
Is the question. Yeah. And I think that over time, like I know Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of the things that I've seen him talk about is that we just haven't developed the science and the testing that is advanced enough to really make those distinctions. Um, but I think that, whether it's varsity or JV, whether it's different weight classes in boxing, we already make distinctions between like what's a fair fight, right? And so I would say that if we're just talking about a bog standard a male in a female event, that let's say boxing or um, what's another good one that's clearly, I don't know, football. I'm not sure track and field is so obvious, but like where a male physique is going to get a clear advantage, it makes that less interesting as a to watch. It's like putting a welterweight against a
like,
heavyweight.
yeah, this is my fault. I think I've sprung ahead and got us a little bit off track. So
Yes.
I do think we should focus on definition of terms. So I think with biological sex, largely most of the population is fairly firmly male or female. Is that fair?
It could be.
Okay. All right. Well, let's keep going.
Okay. So that's the first pillar is biological sex. The second pillar is gender identity, which it has nothing to do with any of the physicality of it. This is how you see yourself. It's how you identify. And do you see yourself as a man or a woman? So I make a distinction between male and female here. So male and female I'm going to use for the biological category, and man or woman I'm going to use for the gender. And
Sorry,
yep.
just to interject slightly here. I I don't know that it's fair to say, as we're defining terms, that gender identity has nothing to do with biological sex. I think they can diverge. There's some alignment in terms of common expression of gender being based on biological sex, for example.
It's interesting. So you're saying that there's a genetic link. It's not there is a genetic link or physical link to how you feel about gender, and I'm saying it's not.
Well, I don't know that I'm necessarily saying that, but we could examine that a little bit later. So most biological males identify as the gender man. Most biological females identify as the gender woman, right? So I think there's a genetic component. It's not causal necessarily, but there is some correlation there that I don't think we can just throw away. I do think that societally, if you talk about environment and upbringing and social norms, for sure, if you're born as a biological male, you're going to most commonly be in an environment that pushes you very firmly towards the identity of the gender of a man. So
I think
all
that
I'm saying is I don't want to say they're not correlated. There is correlation. I'm not saying there's causation.
okay.
Specifically,
I think there will be correlation between all of the pillars. I think
okay,
that's fair to say.
okay.
But I think it's important to make the distinction that biological sex is fundamentally different from gender identity. And gender identity is something that is not tied to biology at all. It's actually tied to culture. And so it's how the culture understands man and woman. And that can change across cultures. So what a man is in French culture can be different from how it is in Singaporean culture, for example. And gender is the expression of culture, the cultural norms that belong to those things. So man is the male expression, and woman is the female expression from a culturally defined perspective. So at the extreme, you would have cis, which is that your gender identity is directly correlated or corresponds to your physical sex, and you have trans, which is the opposite. So your gender identity is the opposite of your physical sex. And then in between, we have non-binary. So these are
So
all of the people that are on a spectrum between those two states.
this is this might be just a bit of a distraction, but it's kind of odd to me to say that trans is the opposite of two things that aren't directly determined by each other. Do you know what I mean? I just wonder.
Trans is the opposite of cis, so it's only one thing.
No, but you're saying that you identify your gender
As
as opposite to your biological sex. But if they're not,
according to the culture, yeah.
yeah, okay. So I think that's important just as a clarification that these pillars are, you've got a spectrum, but in most societies and certainly Western societies, in modern times, you have these kind of strict categories that do align, right?
Hmm.
But we're not saying they're causally aligned. But if you say you're trans, you're implicitly saying that the gender norm and the biological sex don't match, but that gender norm is defined culturally,
Yes.
right? So it's not saying that you're the opposite of your sex. You're really just saying that culture has defined gender and sex as being aligned, and you aren't aligned in that way.
Correct. But I want to define trans as the opposite of it. It's not just not aligned, because that not aligned is spectrum. That's non-binary. So
No, we'll get
the
there. I
extreme,
understand. What I'm just saying, I don't want to tie them together too tightly, since one is biological and one is cultural.
yeah.
So I think one issue that progressives have is policing language a lot, but being looser on ideas. We'll get into that another time. But this is now all in the cultural arena, right? Because now we're saying whether you're trans, cis, non-binary, or other, these are all cultural, and they inherit really the categorizations of biological sex as an expectation that trans goes against. But there's no, we're not saying there's a causality link between biological sex and gender. So really, you're not going against it in a biological sense, just in a cultural sense.
Yeah, correct. Correct. The word against is scary to me, and but I think that's correct. That is what I mean. It's
Okay.
just a scary word.
No,
Okay,
I agree. Yeah.
so that is gender, that's gender identity. The next pillar that we have is gender expression.
Sorry.
So, yeah.
I'm, I know I'm interrupting a lot here. I do want to say that you, you should really give an idea of the spectrum with non-binary included, because I think I interrupted you before you really got to dig into that. So
Oh,
between cis and trans, you have non-binary, right? And
yeah.
I think it's important enough for people to understand that, especially if you're speaking to a boomer and explaining this, what non-binary is, and how there are also folks that have gender fluidity. So maybe you could touch on those two concepts a
Right,
little bit.
yeah, right. So non-binary just means that they're on the spectrum in between the two poles, right? So they're neither cis nor they're trans, they're somewhere in between. And maybe it means that sometimes they feel cis and sometimes they feel trans. And that's different depending on the context that they're in, perhaps, right? But for whatever reason, non-binary just means that I reject seeing myself, because this is about gender identity, I reject seeing myself as only one of those two poles. I'm sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not, maybe sometimes I'm never, right? And then what was your second one?
Gender fluid.
Gender fluid. I think that's what I intended to say with gender fluid is like this that there are times when you move back and forth between the two poles, and probably most of the time where you're somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think they're just subtly different. So to me, I agree. Non-binary is, yeah, I'm not buying into the male, female,
The
dipole,
man woman,
sorry, man,
and
woman dipole of gender identity. I'm just not in that game. And then fluid is more, I mean, I'm going to play along the spectrum. What do I feel like expressing today? I don't feel trapped in a category. I kind of move along the spectrum, whereas non-binary maybe just opts out of it altogether, or feels very much in the middle of the spectrum. I think those are all different, right?
yeah,
So kind
yeah.
of non-binary can be anything from androgyny.
It's like non-binary is sort of is there it's almost like agnosticism to you. That's a wholly different topic, but this is I don't buy into your whole the two sides, whereas fluidity is I do buy into your two sides, and I'm allowed to play all I want within that spectrum.
Although I think non-binary can be a little bit of I don't buy into it, or I'm pretty sure I'm neutral on that spectrum.
Okay, so let's get on to gender expression. So gender identity is how you see yourself, and how you see yourself and how you feel about yourself doesn't need to be expressed. So you might be a trans person, but you may be in a context, in a societal context where that's illegal. You could be killed for that, right? You could be put to death to that. And so then you're going to behave like cis. So gender expression isn't necessarily the same. How we think about ourselves isn't necessarily the same as how we express ourselves. So again, I kind of have the two extremes, masculine and feminine, being the way that society thinks about how um, biological sex should be expressed. I think culturally we sort of miss the whole gender identity thing, and we go straight, we do this correlation thing back to biological sex. So we consider it normal for a male to be masculine and normal for a female to be feminine. Um, and then you have the spectrum, which is various degrees of androgyny, which says, again, I can move across that spectrum all I want. I can't remember the one person who he has a full beard and he wears a dress. I can't remember who that is, but
There's plenty of
he,
them.
yeah, no, but there's one that's been on all the talk shows that I've seen. He's on Colbert and stuff. No, but the idea here is I'm not going to that someone who's androgynous to different degrees is not going to be one or the other and can play along the entire spectrum to where they feel comfortable doing it. Um, this would be like it's generally a feminine female, but they like to do some, they like to man spread and play baseball on the weekends, or drink beer, or things that are considered masculine in the culture.
Yeah,
This is a woman, a female and a woman who is generally feminine but has some characteristics of masculinity. That's somewhere on that spectrum, with androgyny being in the middle of the spectrum.
yeah. I would just want to highlight here that as we move from sex to gender expression, we're getting more and more into culture, and we're also getting more and more into cultural variation, uh, as well as the spectrum within each culture. So, men kissing is very,
Yep.
or holding hands in public might be very common in the Middle East, where it's not viewed as feminine at all. And in the US, it might be viewed as both feminine and gay, and all this other stuff. And we can look at hundreds of examples where these are just not the same. It's not useful to just say it's all over the place, but I do think it's worth saying that, especially when you get from male to man to masculine, you're starting to get to something very culturally specific, because those ideas are getting more and more
Yep.
culturally determined.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go on to the next one. We've got two more pillars. So the next one is sexual orientation. Oh, maybe this is the last one. So with sexual orientation, which is who are you sexually attracted to, or who do you feel romantic love for? Interestingly enough, my daughter said those should be separate pillars. Who you're sexually attracted to versus who you love and want to be in a relationship with. But and she said those are actually different things. For now, I've just kept them as one category because I'm not listening to my kids.
Well, okay,
No, I didn't
just
have any more space on the slide, actually. That's the sad reason.
truth be damned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will echo that just from your daughter, from my daughter as well.
Yep.
And maybe we should have them come in and critique us as an
Yeah.
podcast. So my daughter identifies as gay, and she has definitely said that romantic attraction and sexual attraction are not the same necessarily. So I echo that from her
Yeah.
perspective.
Agreed. Um, For me on the ends of the spectrum here is straight, which is that you're sexually attracted to people of the opposite biological sex, and gay is sexually attracted to people of the same biological sex.
So is that fair, or should we be saying gender and or sex, right?
I I didn't. Maybe that can fall in the center, but maybe it's just that I haven't seen it.
Well, there's a very, there are very, I think this is, you know, think of the examples of straight identifying men who very much are attracted to trans women. This is a whole category of behavior, right? It's surprisingly common in the world. So I think it can be a bit of both or
Both.
either. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I think I need to adjust that. I think that's fair. I think
yeah.
that's fair. Um, in the middle, we have bisexual or asexual, as the case may be that you were talking about before. And so this is where you can be attracted to both or to neither. And that's what we talk about for the spectrum. So
Do
when
you
we
mean,
put all
just going back, do you mean pansensual or pansexual there?
what did I say?
Last bullet.
Ah, I meant pansexual, but
Okay,
could be pansexual. I don't know. I just hadn't heard of that term. I've heard of pansexual, but I haven't heard of pansexual.
I'm the reverse. I will say that both of us went to school at Berkeley, where we both learned a lot of gender theory and observed it in practice in pretty much every way possible. So we were at the epicenter of polyamory and all that other stuff going on.
Yeah, 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 fair enough. Okay, so then we want to put it all together, right? So let's try to imagine real. So, and this is the part that I think my mom was most that impacted my mom the most, right? Because this is about can you imagine how people can be this? Because once you can imagine, once you can see it, and you can see somebody that is not crazy, is not evil, is not brainwashed, then you understand that about the fluidity of all of these things. So, for example, we say, all right, here is a biological male who identifies as a man, acts in masculine ways, and is sexually attracted to women. Obviously, we can imagine that because that's would be considered the norm.
And we are. So
Yes, we are what? Okay, so then I'm still known as Selena Soul in many places, by the way. So then all we do is we change one thing and we say, listen, this is a man who is cisgender identity, but who expresses themselves in very feminine ways and is straight, right? So who's our congressman? I'm thinking of.
I was just thinking of, Harry Styles or I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
So this used to be called metrosexual, which I made fun of because I said the only metrosexual I know is Debbie Does Dallas. I don't know what cities have to do with it, and I don't know how you would have sex with a city. But yeah, I got put in this category quite a bit for some of my clothing and hair choices and such. But sure.
Understandable. Like people like this, right? So it's normal. This is normal. It's a normal way to be.
Sorry. I don't want to use the word normal.
Well, what I want to say is that it's not weird. That this can fall into these are people you know, and they're not the crazy images that are created on television or by the left or the right. The point that I wanted to make here is that if you use the pillars like this and you just move the red dot around, hey, these are just people that you know, and they're not crazy and they're not weird and they're not sick or deranged. They're just people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the latter part, but I wouldn't say that if the last example used to be a transvestite, right? For example, so a straight male who likes to dress as a woman. I get very uncomfortable with the use of the word normal in any of this conversation. I,
Okay.
I think if we're trying to appeal to the better angels of people's nature, it's very easy for them to say, well, sure, the red dots are there, but that's not normal. That red dot is not normal. And from my perspective, I guess normal is along with gender expression, it's a cultural construct which has just been defined, right?
Right.
So if someone
What's a
is,
better word?
some are more
Is it,
common, some are more accepted, right?
could you say that it's not abnormal?
I wouldn't call anything abnormal either. What I would say is,
The people that I'm trying to demonstrate to do call things abnormal. And what I'm trying to demonstrate is that none of that is abnormal. And I'm
well, I
okay saying
agree.
it's not normal, but it's also not abnormal.
Yeah, but if you get on the normal, abnormal spectrum, you've kind of already lost where we're coming from, I think.
Mhm.
What I would say is better languages, there is this spectrum, right? And it's multidimensional and people are in various places. Some are more common, some are less common, some are more accepted, some are less accepted. None of them are deviant per se, right? They deviate from a statistical or accepted norm, but that's just another category. So normal is a category that's culturally constructed,
Right.
or you can call it the middle of a bell curve if
Yeah.
you're statistically.
Yeah.
But for me, the only three things I would say that you can define are, how statistically common is it, right? How culturally accepted is it? And that's where you can say normal, abnormal, but that's a construct. And then how pathological is it? And I would say none of these are pathological. If we get into something like pedophilia, then you're starting to get into a sexual orientation that is pathological. So I think normal, abnormal doesn't really serve the function of this, which is to say there's a spectrum. Some are common, less common, some are more culturally accepted or less culturally accepted.
Mm.
And very, very rarely are things pathological. So we can go to pedophilia or incest or sexual assault, right? And incest is, that's a whole other story, I guess, depending on how you define that. But let's take pedophilia because that's easy and agreed on by everyone. So I don't think it's useful to call it abnormal as much as to call it pathological because it causes harm. So I wouldn't call it anything that you've got on this slide normal or abnormal. I would say some are more common, some are more socially accepted, and none of these are
Mm.
pathological.
Mm-mm-mm. The all of the examples that you gave of pathological were in the sexual orientation category. That as I heard you, would you are there any pathological? Because I think that today's MAGA side would say that trans and gay is pathological.
Yeah, and I think that's where we should have the argument, right? So we shouldn't have the argument about whether it's normal or not. We should have the argument about whether it's pathological or not. And I think it's
Hmm.
pretty easy to argue that those things aren't harming others, right? So the only other pathology that I think would be useful to bring in at this point is gender dysphoria, where your feelings of, gender identity and gender expression are at odds with your biological sex and with societal or cultural expectation. And that is pathological because it causes harm to you psychologically, right? So I'd say if we can get more conservative folks to agree that we're not talking about normal or abnormal, we're talking about pathological versus not, then gay and trans, these are not pathological behaviors, right? Or expressions or identity. So I think that's actually,
Let me go back to so I make sure I capture them. So one is how common is it?
mhm,
Then three is it pathological or not? What was two again?
culturally accepted.
Culturally accepted. Okay.
So I would say, so for certain more conservative, religious, right wing, whatever you want to call it, folks, they can say that, gay or trans is less acceptable. They can claim it's pathological, but I don't think they can back that up, right? So then we're actually, this is why I like defining terms, right? Because then we're
Right.
actually having the right argument, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to have a normal abnormal argument. I don't think that's meaningful in this context.
Right. 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 Okay. Well, I don't want to go through all of these, right? The key is
Yeah.
I was just moving the red dots around and demonstrating that you can imagine non-pathological people that you know that are not bad people. I guess that's pathological, and that's it.
Okay. So I think that's going to get us into kind of the further discussion, which is why the hell do people care about this so much? Why is it so controversial and divisive? Um, let's take a quick break because I'm having some technical difficulties with the sun.
Oh, I can see.
Yeah, and we'll come back in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, so I think that was clarifying for me to some degree. Again, kind of looking at the linkages between these pillars and also hopefully getting away from normal abnormal to kind of what we're really talking about, which is common, accepted, pathological, where these things lie on there. And what I kind of left with was, why does this all matter? And it's it matters a lot because of power, I think, is what it comes down to. Maybe I'm getting a little Marxist on this, which is unlike me, but um, so in a historical and kind of global context, right, we can start with the simplest, which is most of human society currently and through history has been patriarchal, right? So men, specifically straight men, have had more power. There have been exceptions. There have been matriarchal and matrilineal societies, right? But by and large, straight men have held a lot of power, and they've often abused this power against women and LGBTQ folks in various ways. And I think we've seen historically a trend in Western society to expand the rights of women and LGBTQ folks. And we would see that as progress. And I think other people would see that as a bit threatening. Um, from the perspective, of more conservative folks, I think there's a little bit of a myth that, well, this is evolutionary. This is the science says that men are men and women are women, and you know, men do the hunting and gathering, and women do the collecting, and men are in charge, and women run the house, and blah 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 blah. And what I will say is that again, that's all at the cultural level. That is not biological. That is not genetic. That is not evolutionary. Um, there are obvious physical differences between biological men, biological women, and intersex and so forth. But using that as any kind of justification for patriarchy or oppression, persecution of LGBTQ folks it doesn't hold water with me, right? Um, so I think it's just kind of important to say, yes, there are examples where this is different, where there have been matriarchal societies. There have been, powerful women-led societies. There have been, across different cultures, third genders, which have been very accepted in Native American culture, some parts of Asia. It's just, that's what they are. It's a recognized role as a cultural category. And it is not, in some traditions, they were seen as kind of magical, which is probably also not helpful. But, you know, LGBTQ folks, women, everyone can be as much of an asshole and much of a great person as anyone who isn't in those categories. It's not aligned. It's not correlated. But what I think is interesting is to think where we are now, not so long ago, just in Western civilization in Britain in the 1900s, you still had gay people being uh, executed for homosexuality. You had Alan Turing, a huge genius in computer science, being forcibly sterilized and committing suicide because of his sexuality. So this stuff is very relevant and very harmful in terms of the power dynamics at play. And just on the side of patriarchy, 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women, and 50% of society is women. And that is not accidental, that is not biological, that is political, that is cultural, that is patriarchal. And so when I see conservatives say, well, we have to go back to a golden age, you're talking back to a golden age where it was even worse, right? And we're looking at how do these power dynamics play out? How do they evolve? How do they differ by culture? And how can we achieve equality and equal rights in different ways? And those power dynamics are played not just in Western society, but you see, the controversies in India over rampant sexual assault, which have really spurred a reckoning within that society about misogyny and femicide and sexual assault. That is, it's important to really bring that up to the fore and take steps to correct those damaging pathological behaviors. Also, you see, this is more controversial, but in Islam, you have, however you feel about the hijab or the niqab, is it something that should be enforced, right? You had in Iran where someone from a minority, a woman was, beaten and ultimately killed for what she was wearing because of didn't fit the gender role of the society. You have obviously homosexuality being persecuted pretty explicitly and directly. And we'll get into maybe a little bit of how different religions treat these categories a little bit later on. But you have in Africa, and I believe Uganda and some of the other countries, you have really draconian anti-gay laws coming into force, which threaten the lives and the livelihoods of people with really no moral justification. And then on conversely, you have something that, Obama said that he didn't think America was ready for gay marriage and that it was not the right time. And then that was very recently, and it happened, and it's really not an argument anymore, right? So the variation in historical contexts and global contexts of how power interacts with these categories is, again, along a spectrum, and it evolves quite a bit, but it's causing a lot of political divide today, which is kind of what I want to get into next.
So if I tried to summarize all of that, because that was a lot, it's essentially that these five pillars of gender and sex are manipulated by hegemonic forces that have power to um, hurt people who are not aligned to the classic model, if you will.
Yeah, and to a
And
certain
that
extent,
many different cultures and many different religions, all of them have their way to do it, but everybody is screwing the person who doesn't fit the norm. I shouldn't. Yeah,
but we can say norm is a cultural norm, right?
yeah.
I mean, that's where that is properly placed, unless it's statistically in the middle. Yeah, so I think it's asserting control, right? So you get to asserting control over women's bodies with the pro-life movement. The political manipulation and assertion of control on the basis of these categories is, as you say, widespread, globally, historically, in different cultures.
It's harmful. So you're saying it's wholly wrong.
I would say, I would,
Yeah,
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 because what you're doing is you are doing two really important things. You are marginalizing people for where they stand in these different categories, right?
yeah.
Which generally
Or not.
deprives them of rights, right?
Yep.
You're
Correct. Correct. Correct.
you're disenfranchising people, and again, on the basis of something that is doing no harm to anyone else.
So that's the big I think that's the crux here where somebody I think from the MAGA side would differ because they would say that homosexuality is abhorrent, is pathological, and that just being homosexual causes other people to get brainwashed into that evil way of life, right? So it's like if you teach it at my school, then my poor, innocent children might get confused and fall prey to the devil. How do you respond to that?
With great claims, I would require great evidence. I don't see that happening. I'm not aware of that happening. I would let me actually take on that role to a degree and play devil's advocate because I think there are some
But but I mean,
un yeah,
along that though, I just want to say, like the evidence is the Bible, they would say. I don't need more evidence than God's word
okay, well, I would say two things to that, maybe three. Uh, Firstly,
and a fuzzy pillow.
yeah, well, firstly, the Bible as evidence is, mm, I don't know, it was made by a bunch of men
It
thousands of
would be
years.
nice. It would be nice if you can address that
Three
argument
things.
without.
Three things.
Okay.
Okay. So, firstly, taking the Bible of evidence as evidence. Look, if you are basing everything on your interpretation of this old book, and that is really your touchstone, and science and data don't enter into it, then you are not open to a discussion. And so there's really nothing to say. What I would say that the Bible doesn't explicitly say that gay people are terrible. But it also says, don't take your neighbor's slaves. It says a lot of shit that we don't use today, right? So you pick and choose. And I think what a lot of evangelicals have done is pick a few parts out of the Bible to suit their political purposes to persecute others. And the Bible can be interpreted a lot of different ways. Secondly, what I would say is freedom of religion is supposed to be an American and a Western value, and you can't use as your argument that everyone should behave
Mhm.
according to my
Yeah. Right.
religion,
Yep.
right? So if you're saying that, you're talking about Christian nationalism and theocracy. And that's a whole different conversation to have, which I think is valid because it's scary as fuck, but that's a different conversation, right? And thirdly, um, show me the harm. Give me statistics showing the actual harm, right? And then let's focus on that, okay? And I think there are a few cases to be made that are interesting topics of discussion that I'm going to turn to right now. I'm going to play devil's advocate and I'm going to kind of critique some of the more leftist views on these issues. So, first, I want to level set, which is the progress that is made in equality for women and LGBTQ people has been hard fought and hard won by progressives and activists that care and do the right thing. And it's invaluable. And I don't want to put any of that aside. But what I do want to talk about is where are we now? And is this the best approach to actually achieving progressive goals that you want to? So, one thing is, I get uncomfortable when rather than trying to legislate and advocate for equal rights for these categories, you start trying to police culture and say, you know, be the language police, cancel people. You can't say this, you can't say that, right? Um, I know this is a really small, innocuous example that I can associate with you personally. So um, using he, him pronouns on your LinkedIn profile, right? Is that important or is it virtue signaling, right? Preaching to the choir for what, the less than 1% of trans people that may or may not feel more comfortable if everyone starts a meeting talking about their pronouns? Is that really the battle that progressives should be fighting? Because to me, that's not political equality, that's cultural enforcement of your ideas. And that can be a slippery slope. No, thought you might respond to that one.
Well, I, I thought it was a critique of the left, which is fine. And I think that I think language police, woke, and culture police are all great examples of taking this too far. And I really like your idea. Your the best idea for me that you've brought out is it's about harm. It's about pathology. Like that's what we need to focus on. And let's establish whether it's harmful or not. If it's not harmful, then this is just a minority in society. And in a liberal traditions, we protect the minorities for because of this power imbalance. Um, my view on the using pronouns. I use one on my LinkedIn profile, which is in fact potentially the gives the it could give the very opposite perspective of what I intend. Because I don't care. Use any pronoun that you want. I have been all of them in the past, so it doesn't. So and I don't identify one way or the other. I identify as I guess I'm more in the middle. I don't identify man, woman. I actually, from a gender perspective, I don't care. It's not a interesting. It's not an. It's not something that's interesting to me. Um, and
I guess my
so it's
impression, go ahead, sorry.
what could be offensive about that is it could look like I'm making fun of the whole thing, like saying that announcing your pronouns, I'm saying it doesn't matter. And but for me, the reason I put it on my LinkedIn profile was simply it's an ally question. It's to say that I
Yeah,
see you, I hear you, and I think that there's a lot of people with I think way more people that are on the spectrum of gender than there are on the spectrum of biological sex, especially in the newer generations.
I'm going to get to that in a little bit because that's actually really interesting. So I guess, and again, I'm playing devil's advocate here. So opening a meeting with everyone saying they're giving their pronouns,
Yeah, that's over the top.
right? That to me harms what you're trying to achieve with equal
Yeah.
rights, right?
Yep.
Um, I'm I wish we hadn't let the right co-opt the word woke because
Yeah, I know.
it
I
should,
know.
and DEI, right? Because ultimately
Yeah.
those terms, right? Woke just means you are trying to be aware of what the
Yeah.
hell is happening in the world, right?
Yeah.
And DEI, okay, do you dislike diversity? Because I think American society was built on that. Do you dislike equity?
Inclusion. Equity.
Just
Yeah,
like
exactly.
inclusion, but what part of it don't you actually like? Because it seems like what you're saying is you don't like affirmative action, but that is not the same thing, and they're getting conflated. And I think,
Yeah.
progressives are letting this shit happen, right?
Yeah.
They are letting the narrative get taken because they're so focused on the language, they're so focused on the cultural context that they're not fighting the right fight, and they're getting dragged into this cynical bullshit washing machine by the right where they're just saying, okay, well, you don't care about inflation, you just care about trans folks playing sports, right? And that's less than 1% of the population. And people are not going to vote that way. And letting that happen is really a disservice to what I think progressives should be and have achieved, right? Should be trying to
Yeah.
and have achieved. So when we get people saying, oh, you're dead naming someone who's trans, and you're you're really attacking people that could be allies, and you're attacking people for things that, is that the battle you want to fight, right? So I firmly believe that, people should choose their own names, choose their own pronouns. That's all fine. And nobody should give a shit. It should not be a big deal, right? But if that becomes your battle line, then you're losing, right?
Yeah. There's an interesting case. I'm not sure how to. I totally agree with that. But there's an interesting case I'm thinking of now, and I'm just wondering how it is it fall in the same camp, which is that there is when we are working with Australia teams, when they open a meeting, they say, let's take a moment to appreciate the First Peoples
Yeah,
and the history of you
yeah.
know what we've done to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I like that. Like I like what they do it every time, and it in a way it feels like, oh shit, like they're gonna do it every time. It's like the
Yeah,
pronouns,
but
but
again,
that one I
but again, you're more concerned about the story and the language than you are about affecting change, right? If you're so concerned about what's been taken away from the indigenous people, fight for actual indigenous rights, right?
but yes, but I think that the original intent is to just drive awareness and drive a moment to take yourself out of the current project management context that you're in and just take a moment during the day to recognize something, an injustice,
But why does
and
that
it
belong in
because
a
it makes you
business
more
meeting?
likely to act.
But why does it belong in a business meeting? It's not a political discussion, it's a business meeting, right?
Yeah,
And and for the people who have a different opinion on that subject, they just feel like they're being preached to. It's
yeah.
not, is it really creating the change that you want to create? Or is it just creating more resistance?
I don't know. I like that one, but I'm
I,
okay on I'm with you on the
I,
pronouns.
I mean, I don't disagree on a lot of this stuff. I'm again playing devil's advocate, but I do I do sense that a lot of the resistance is down to, if you don't see the world my way, it's not enough that people have equal rights. You have to have my
Yeah,
cultural
yeah. Right.
perspective,
Correct,
or
correct,
else
correct.
you're as bad as a racist or a pedophile. You're a terrible human being,
Yes.
right? And that's where I think you lose things, right? Because it's like, maybe you are uncomfortable around trans people, and that is a thing. It doesn't equate to taking away people's rights. They're different
Yeah.
conversations. And I want to focus the movement on, you know,
The rights.
language matters, but what matters more is legal protections, equal
Mhm.
opportunity, economic power. These are the things. Protection from violence, right? So let's get specifically to the trans issue, because I think this is where it gets very, very focused and really divisive, right? So on the one hand, trans folks are less than 1% of the population, but they seem to take up so much political space, right? And on the left side, I think it's very valid to say, look, trans people are 4 times as likely to be victims of violence. They're much more likely to die by suicide, right? They are being physically and psychologically harmed by others on a regular basis and by society, and they need protection, right? That I believe in firmly. I will fight for that, right? where it gets slippery is that is not what everything is about, right? And what the right does is they say, oh, well, all you care about is this one, less than 1% of people, and you want, biological males beating the shit out of biological females in boxing. And that's a cynical distraction from actually achieving equality and protecting people. And the
Yeah.
left is letting them get away with that shit. Um, I think, and we should discuss this because you brought it up earlier. I think trans participation in sports is tricky. It's difficult, right? It's not straightforward. Um, I don't think you're a bad person to not be sure how to treat this issue, right?
Mm.
Um, and by demonizing folks like J.K. Rowling as turfs, you really do a disservice to people that could be allies and help with this fight, which is let's protect the actual physical and psychological safety of trans people. And trans sports is tricky. It's difficult on a biological sense, in a sense of fairness. And I don't know where I come down on it exactly. What I think is we should have a rational discussion with experts in science and sports to really look at it and decide how to treat it, with the realization that this affects a tiny, tiny number of people, right? And if you're talking about youth sports, it just doesn't fucking matter, right? It just doesn't. And when you get beyond
But
that,
it does matter because of the percentages of the population. Or are you saying it doesn't matter because boys and girls are the same?
both in youth sports, right? At that level, right? So you have in Republican states, you have more bills about trans bathrooms and trans sports than you have trans athletes in the fucking state, right? It's ridiculous. So, uh, and that again, it's being cynically, diabolically leveraged by the right to punish the left, and the left is allowing people to do that because they're picking the wrong battle, in my opinion. Well,
Mm.
what do you think about the sports issue?
Oh, I just to me to me it's just it's a classification thing. Like you could have a trans league. You know, it's like it's same as you would have again, it's like heavyweights and lightweights and middleweights or whatever it is. We do that all the time. JV, varsity. We divide up the players in almost all sports. In all sports, there's minor league baseball, major league baseball. We divide it up based on whether it's
Competitive
gonna,
fairness.
yeah, whether it's gonna be fun to watch. So to me, uh, the gender issue in sports is just this is another categorization, and we don't yet know enough about the science in order to have good categorizations. Like, I think that how much testosterone difference is there in these athletes, and it's just a matter of time. Eventually, if we care enough about this issue, if we care enough about the issue, we will figure out how to categorize them in a fair way, and that's all.
And why is it political at all,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, in the end, it all comes down to USA Christianity. I mean, evangelicalism. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the reason it's a political issue at all is because of the
Yeah.
Christianization of American democracy.
I mean, I would say some of the examples, even recently, that Trump used and other folks on the right have used. So in the women's boxing in the Olympics, right? You were talking about a woman who was born biologically female, identified as female, never identified as male, was recognized by the sport as female the entire time, right? There was one boxing authority which has been completely, put out of business because they're so terrible, that questioned whether there was a testosterone issue. There was no evidence, no proof, nothing. But this became a perception that it was this huge issue, and it really wasn't. And you had it in track, you had Samaya, um, again, born a woman, identified as a woman. Testosterone levels were high in this case specifically, but as to your point, take it on a case by case basis and figure out what's fair. And I would be very, very leery of legislating a lot of this politically, and it should be down to experts dealing with it, especially since
Yeah, yeah. It does
the
not. Whether there is a welterweight or featherweight is not. There's no law about that. It's the sport
yeah,
creates the playing field and the rules, and you should let them do it.
and I think especially when you're talking about young people who are very, very vulnerable to the harms that we've talked about for trans kids and trans people, violence and psychological harm. I mean, just don't further other them. I mean, it's not, they're not doing harm. So don't harm them. And I think we can get through it a lot more easily that way.
Mm.
Um, but I think we've gone from critiquing the left to critiquing the right, which is kind of where we are now. Um, so why, so what it comes back to me, and you touched on this a little bit, is why is the right, or why are people politically right of center um, so straight, male, and afraid? Why is it just, it's called homophobia for a reason, right? Because people are literally afraid of gayness. I tend to think more internally than externally. um,
I, but I think it's across all the pillars though. Like at least in Singapore, the more evangelical type, um, like they think that the masculine and feminine masculinity and femininity piece is totally messed up and that is pathological for society. It's against God's way. Like that, you mentioned before, men go to work, women stay at home and take care of the kids. And there's this really big contingent that it's like the reason that all of this stuff is being caused is because we've had a break, like because women aren't being too masculine and they need to become more feminine.
yeah, that reeks of authoritarianism to me. And it sounds, I mean, it really does. It's totalitarian in its approach, which is defining what people should be, not based on what they do or what harm they cause, but by your categories. Sorry, I wanted to just go back to one thing, which I think is really interesting. Um, I can't pull it up for you, but um, so the historical prevalence of homosexuality has been, through time, extremely consistent, um, except for some outliers where it is more culturally acceptable, like ancient Greece, for example, and Persia and other places where it was, I mean, those categories did not exist as those categories then, as they do now. But the behavior was definitely seen as more acceptable and more widely practiced. But one of the arguments that you actually referred to was if you're teaching this in schools, you're turning people gay, right?
Right.
And the statistics are a little bit interesting on that front, right? So I'm looking at a Gallup poll now. So percent identification self-identified as LGBT, 2012, 3.5%. 2021, 9 years, double, 7.1%, right? Now, that is not something happening biologically, that is something cultural. Because I can tell you, unless you're doing severe gene editing, you're not getting that difference evolutionarily in 9 years. So an argument is that there is contagion, right? And I'll use scare quotes for that, which is, as you say, if you teach kids about gayness and queerness and whatever else, then you're turning them gay, queer, trans, whatever you might think, right? So it's a bit of a straw man argument from my point of view, but what is your response to that?
Oh, well, I mean, to me, I again, non-scientific here, but my view is that there's 15% of the population is gay in all times, and in sometimes it's very difficult to come out, and sometimes it's very easy to come out. And when it's easy to come out, the numbers go up, and when it's very difficult to come out, the numbers go down. And that's pretty much it. It's like the more punished you are for being in that minority, the less likely you are to answer a Gallup poll and say I'm LGBT. You're just going to be like, in fact, you may think you're straight. You may have been conditioned um, by the culture to just accept that. Um,
A conversion therapy, baby.
yeah, the opposite way.
Um,
Um,
yeah, go ahead.
so teaching it in school, right, is sending a cultural signal to the younger people that are still learning the culture and becoming brainwashed by the culture, and it is sending a signal that this is acceptable. This is an
Mhm.
acceptable thing to discuss. It's an acceptable thing to be, and therefore you're freeing that person who was gay to be gay.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Well, I tend to agree. Let me just dig into the numbers a little bit here. So, percent self-identification in 2021 as LGBT by age cohort. So, born before
Oh.
1946, 0.8%. 46 to 64, 2.6%. Gen X, that's us, 4.2%. Millennials, 10.5%. And Gen Z, 20.8%. So 30 times as likely, or somewhere around there, as baby boomers to be self-identified as LGBT.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so on the one hand, I totally agree that, well, there's three things I will say. One is, I do think it's a little bit trendy, and there's a cultural cachet to being, it's like white kids listening to hip hop. I mean, it's kind of cooler than your parents to be LGBTQ, right?
Right.
And I think that is fair. And I also think that's totally fine. Again, there's no harm, right? So,
Well,
unless you're creating gender dysphoria and confusing people, which some on the right would say,
they would
you're
also say fundamentally there are certain laws of nature, and God says this. Like I still think that there's this fundamental belief within the pillars as defined by at least the Judeo-Christian religions as this is truth, everything else is the devil. And I just
so
think that's driving everything.
okay, I agree. So I did want to get into that. So one thing is these religions ultimately, and okay, so you said biologically, but that is out of the table. That's off the table. This is not, they don't have scientific data. They don't have, animals have a certain percentage
Yeah,
that are gray.
yeah,
So it's
exactly.
not, they have no scientific leg to stand on. And then you go back to the Bible and you just say, this book told me it's evil, you interpreted it that way,
I don't know what to do with it either.
right?
It's a very
So,
different discussion. It goes then, then it goes then you it's a religion discussion, and because it's like you can't even have the gender discussion with these people because you have to have the religion discussion first, and on that level there's no way turning around these people.
well, I don't know that that's true because, for example, historically, before the Bible was put together in its current more or less form, there were female apostles, right? So there have been historical traditions in Christianity that did have more female empowerment, and men took that out. They removed that as a political moment. I mean, the Bible was put together hundreds of years after Jesus died. He had no actual input. Nobody knows what he looks like. Nobody knows what he actually said. All this stuff was put together for a political purpose. It was a political document made by men to enforce their control over the church and over society. So if you get to the theological level textually, you can interpret the Bible differently. The Bible is a human made document, right?
I'm with you, but this is too far off the topic. This has to be a different uh
Yeah.
podcast.
But what I will say is, so I agree historically, religion has been interpreted more recently, right, to be less accepting of these categories outside of what they would accept as the norm, right? So the hijab and the niqab are not historically part of society. That's much more recent, right? Um, before before evangelical Christianity and the moral majority, um, the church actually didn't care that much about controlling women's access to reproductive care or about homosexuality, um, unless it was in the church itself, which they hid. So uh, this is historically placed in more recent history, and it's all political. So to me, you go back to literal witch hunts, which were attacking females who had been marginalized, some of whom I think we can assume are queer based on the accounts, right? So they were persecuted specifically for, sexual deviance, right? Either with the devil or with each other, as well as other things. You had uh, Stonewall, you had in less Christian specifically, but again, politically, you have conversion therapy run by the church, scientifically proven not to work and to just be harmful. But that is a recent phenomenon as well. And I do think, just on the gay issue, it is homophobia. It is literal fear internally of people feeling like they're homosexual if they accept homosexuality. And that fear is driving hate and oppression.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we're getting close to wrapping up.
Yeah.
But yeah, the hysteria is cynical political division. It's being used as a political tool. We talked about anti-DEI stuff, and we touched a little bit on women's reproductive rights, but again, it's just an assertion of control. And it's getting worse online, right? So you have incels who basically say, I can't get laid, so I hate women. You have the Andrew Tate situation where he says, these these traditional roles let me sexually assault women. It's very much metastasizing through online discourse in a way that scares me quite a bit, in combination with the fact that authoritarian states are using traditional values and family values to oppress these other groups and to, you know, from Trump to Orban to Khamenei to Putin, to say, we're standing up for tradition, we're standing up for morality, and these decadent, deviant behaviors are undermining society and weakening us. And again, what I would say is there is no harm except the harm that they are doing to these marginalized groups. And that is something that needs to be fought, needs to be clear-eyed, and needs to be addressed legally and politically. And it's a scary time.
Preach.